Hello all, thank you for coming. How to introduce Verity-Jane? Well, she's a visual artist. Correct. No, I was talking about it to Michelle, and we thought that one of the before when we started thinking about inviting you, and we thought that one of the things that there's this family nearly of people around the world who have this strange obsession with spending as much time as possible and going as deeply as possible into places where nobody ever wants to go. So whose idea of an excursion does not mean past the Gothic ornaments or the Gothic monuments of a city, but who take the tram line of any city in any country to the last stop, and then start wandering in between the high rises and the suburbs and the industrial estates, etc. And not just out of a morbid, if it would just be a morbid interest, it would be, we wouldn't, I think, do it for so long. But one of the people who has a very, very special position in, I believe, in that family, is Verity-Jane, because she goes at it with the not just the intelligence and the resilience of a visual artist, but also with a set of visual and aesthetic and you could say graphic tools that makes her work transcend just the anthropological, if you know what I mean. And this works not, and it also transcends the purely architectural. That's why I also find that Verity-Jane's work on the outer boroughs of London, and now also on some that are a little bit younger, has such a great meaning, not just for the world of visual arts or the world of anthropology, but especially also to the world of architecture. But without giving anything away, I give you Verity-Jane Keefe.
If you could just follow me around all the time, that's really good for my confidence. And just say that all the time, you could be my hype man. So full disclaimer, I don't really like giving talks, so you're very lucky. But I put myself through it, but I'm reading off paper and then I'll kind of freestyle a bit later. I'll try and coordinate holding a microphone at the same time, so let's see how this goes. Bear with me. So yeah, my name's Verity-Jane Keefe. Verity-Jane to my mum, Verity to me and the profession, but yeah, formerly VJK. And I'm an artist. I think it's really important that I foreground my practice as an artist. So I did study fine art sculpture, but I do work predominantly in the public realm, using moving image and installation-based work to explore the often complex relationships between people and place. So mine is a research practice at its heart, underpinned by the exploration of how to turn a seed of an idea into a thing. For want of a better word, and I've tried loads of words, I often describe my practice as lurking. This question of what happens when you stay, when you keep looking, when you overhear, when you loiter, when you just kind of hang around. And I hope everybody can understand my West Midlands accent as well. It's not a received pronunciation. Yeah. So I'll just caveat this as well, that when I graduated from fine art sculpture in 2003, the idea of the public realm, certainly in the UK as a space for practice, wasn't that common. Residencies, etc., off-site, site-specific commissions, they were all relatively new territory in the gallery world at large. This was the time of public art with a capital P and an A, so plonk art, which I suppose I've always been interested in pushing back on. Anyway, so I'm going to take you on a quick romp through some slides of my work from then to now, as it's all connected, and I'll then do a deep dive into current and ongoing work, a lot of which has had to shift and change to respond and absorb the world imploding in the last 2 years, as with you all, as with everybody, I suppose. So this idea of the role and the potential of the artist within a regeneration context context is, could and should be really, really interests me. Just really getting under the skin of a place and actually trying to take a seat at the table, quite often when you're not invited. As an artist, I think we hold quite a lot of mystery. So I find myself working within planning policy contexts, regeneration contexts, urban design contexts, art contexts, heritage contexts, all sorts, but most often in a municipal setting. Because I think fundamentally a lot of people don't know what artists do, and I think you can play with that, and I think a lot of people have an idea of what artists do, and then you can challenge that. So I tried to interrogate this notion of public in its widest, transient and potential future versions of itself, mindful that work needs to make sense to not just those privy to the process, but those that experience a stage of it, the outcome, or see the work in a separate context, away from the place that it responds to, not being overly reliant on me telling you a story in a place, about a place. So regeneration, participation, consultation, collaboration, community, engagement, legacy, resilience, public, placemaking. These are all buzzwords that get chucked all over the place on hoardings, in funding applications, in artist briefs and in clients' desires. So my work really tries to test what these words could mean and how working in such a way can inform and shape not just the actual built environment, but what the experience of living and passing through it is and potentially can be. Yeah. So VJK for LBBD, that's the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, for those of you that don't know it, which probably none of you do. Accidental love affairs and other stories. So the majority of my practice looks at Outer London, in particular my ongoing, often tumultuous, never boring accidental love affair with the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. I'm not from there, but I both blame and thank Muff Architecture and Art for this, as I was working as an artist there when I first worked in the borough back in 2005 and 6, working on this, The Folly, and was the first artist in residence for the borough, a period that I don't really feel is ended yet, but it is ending really soon, which is good. So it's 15 years of work I'm going to romp you through, which is really accelerated in the last 3 years. I'm committed, I'm shaking holding this as well, sorry. I'm committed to long periods of engagement, of close looking and testing before committing to final outcomes. What happens when you stay in a place and your practice evolves and changes with that place versus dropping in, chipping off, popping up, popping down, next? Most of my commissions are self-generated or often developed with a variety of stakeholders as clients. I'm not sure if any of you know much about the UK funding context, but we are kind of at the last drops of public funding. The public purse is pretty much empty. And my career has been made. I've kind of explored how I can make work solely from the public purse, so I'm at quite an interesting position at the moment of thinking how, as an artist, I can respond to the changes in funding mechanisms too. I don't know how that's going yet, but I'll let you know in the next decade. So I talked earlier about many of the, I really like working with a variety of stakeholders, all these different departments, thinking of having multiple clients, so the demolition company as client, the developer, the local authority, the cleaner. This is key to the way I work. I learned early on I don't collaborate well with other artists. I work well with architects, planners, bricklayers, demolition workers, councillors, and I really, really work well with residents, looking for agency and where I can give agency. So this is my badge as artist in residence, really young me. And I always show this, so I think it's quite interesting in terms of like this idea of accident. I needed a badge because I needed to access the building because my camera was in a building on a time lapse in a cabinet that I'd made. And the guy that issues the badge in the council was like, oh, well, what do I put on your badge? I was like, well, that's your job. You need to tell me. I'm an artist. And then the head of culture was like, well, do you want to be artist in residence? And I was like, yeah, okay. And it was literally that, something that's used to access a building and kind of open up a magnetic panel, but it also became this, this emblem, this idea of thinking of the historical municipal context and how you used to have architects working in boroughs, planners working in boroughs, but you didn't have artists embedded within local councils. So I carry this badge with me kind of at the foreground of my brain, actually, just thinking of like what that means to be working so publicly with public funding. But I don't think the council care less, so that's a whole other question. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I think it's really important to talk about the then and to how that's got to now, because I was just talking to Michelle and Wouter about this just over by the bar, like when I don't really think that things end, and I had a moment of sort of liberation earlier on in my career where I was like, oh, okay, maybe we just have these one idea or this handful of ideas that we're just going to spend our careers kind of thrashing out or going back to or editing or filtering, and that's fine. And then some things finish and you might take them forward. So the Mobile Museum, I learnt a lot from this project. So this image that you see here represents a year of behind-the-scenes aspects of my practice. I was never told at art college that I'd have to be my own cheerleader. I'd have to wear all these different hats, be fundraiser, be pitcher, be strategist, be policy negotiator. No one ever told me that. And if anyone wants to find out more about this project, there's loads written about it. I don't need to talk too much about it. However, it was really important. It was an old, built in 2001, the actual vehicle. I purchased it in 2014, I think, via an Arts Council grant, and had match funding from the local authority. Austerity hit in the UK, and local authorities got completely massacred. And my little pot of money, it's not little, it was quite significant actually, £10,000 was cut in that first wave of public sector funding. And I am not from a wealthy background, and I certainly don't have £10,000 like hidden in a bag under my mattress. But I'd already bought the vehicle, and I'd already learned. I went and did my lorry driving test, so it was I was kind of fucked, really. So I had to kind of find a way to raise this £10,000, and this really, it really opened up a big part of my practice. So I did a Kickstarter, which now it feels like everybody and their grandma does a Kickstarter, but then there weren't that many, and it was really important for me in terms of democratizing the audience and the actual process of this work, and how it opened it up, this idea that you're making work in such a hyper-local context about a place where I doubt many people in this room have been to, Barking and Dagenham, but how do you make that resonate to a more international kind of political or context? So I did a Kickstarter, and I went from having two funders by the Arts Council and the Council to having 363 overnight with all of these backers. And it was kind of a global audience, but from backgrounds of geography, geology, architecture, politics, local history, all sorts. And it was wild. It was quite an eccentrically wild process. And the whole point was that Barking and Dagenham, the reason I've ended up working there was that I could have autonomy. I was working with Muff, and I really enjoyed the fact that no one else was working there. I really enjoyed as an artist I could just hang around and no one would come up to me and be like, what are you doing? You know, hands off, I'm doing an art project here. Like, no one cared that I was an artist, and I could just kind of operate between the cracks a little bit and just develop and think and make work. But it's a borough that's dominated by statistics. Everybody likes to talk about the place as being the most miserable, the most deprived, the highest Brexit vote in London, the rise of the far right, UKIP, BNP, all of these things. And actually people are people. All of those statistics exist, but I really wanted to kind of think about, well, you know, what's an actual place like if you stay? And why is engagement so low? Why is it hard to get people to get involved? So this project was developed via the old mobile library routes, and the simple premise was to build a museum in a library that replicated this, that kind of mapped the idea of evolution and natural history against the evolution of the council house, which sounds a bit insane when you say it out loud. I worked with a curator from the Horniman Museum in South East London. If ever you go to London, I'd really recommend going. And thinking, is it possible to classify the lived experience? Is it possible to overlay a taxonomy to places in flux, to people in flux, to feelings and thoughts? So Hearts, this is one example. I made a natural history collection with people in the borough. The project was supposed to last for 3 months, and it ended up lasting for 4 years in many different ways. But this is one example of the collection. Hearts Lane is an estate built in 1970, built on the site of a former asbestos works, which doesn't feel very great to me. So this is a piece of aggregate that we did an archaeology survey archaeological dig on the site, and we picked up bits of aggregate, had them cleaned to make sure they weren't contaminated, and then varnished them to make them look like asbestos and muscovite. And this is a piece of hair weave bought from, like a wig bought from Barking Market, which we then grafted on with residents. Made an evolution of the actual council houses. Becontree is important because that's what I'll talk about mainly in a bit. So Becontree was another big statistics estate. It was the world's largest social housing estate for a long time, and is still the largest in Europe when it was built in 1921. So you go from like this cottage style housing typology right through to sort of 1970s slab bison block construction out of the photo, and on and on. Don't need to talk about that. And then it got vandalised. So that's why I was showing this. So Wouter just asked me what happened to that. So I always think about how you represent projects. I could leave it here and be like, and this is the best thing I ever did, and it was really great, and I drove it to the Barbican, and it really expanded my professional network, and I'm a fucking great artist. But things don't work like that. It was horrific, and I learnt loads, but it was also the best thing I've ever done. But I ended up having to do most of it myself. I ended up having to build, which is great actually, because I've got loads of skills. I've got a future career as a kitchen fitter now because I built it because I couldn't afford to pay the carpenter, all of this kind of stuff. I drove it myself instead of paying a driver. However, so I could say this is it, on to the next commission, but then it did get vandalised. It did get broken into, and it kind of felt like a grieving process. But the politics of this were really interesting to me. Like I could have seen this coming. They didn't break into it because it was an art project or because it was mine, because I also feel, the way that the Mobile Museum existed, it was interested in this idea of disguising art practice rather than driving into a place and be like, hey, I'm an artist, let's do some art together. You kind of go and develop relationships. That's how I work. I go, I look, I develop relationships, and then I decide what I'm going to do with the people I'm developing relationships with, rather than going in there with my idea of a workshop coming off the shelf, and this is what we'll do. So, yeah, it got vandalised by some young people who had tension with the council, and it wasn't anything to do with me, but the politics of that were important to me. So and he was stupid enough to tag the vehicle with his Instagram handle, silly sausage. And part of a gang in Dagenham, and the way I processed it actually was to incorporate the actual vandalism as part of the collection and as part of the work, because most of the collection was destroyed. So I've stripped out all of the detritus and the broken glass and the graffitied sunscreen windows, and have now archived that as all part of the collection, this kind of catalogue B, if you think, the way I think about it. And then I made this little Mobile Museum trolley, which has some of the remaining bits of the collection, which will now live at the local archives as a sort of bookable resource. And that feels like a good, the way I talk about it now, it's like, yeah, it's all sorted, but that was a trip. But the reason I'm talking about that, because in the Mobile Museum, I talk about Becontree, which is where I've spent a big chunk of time recently, living together. I'll go back to paper now. Is everyone following so far? All clear? Good. So yeah, I've been working in and around Becontree, not exclusively, but it has been a dominant site since about 2014, and much more intensively since 2017, 2018, when conversations started to emerge about the then upcoming centenary year of 2021. Would I like to be involved? Would I like to develop an art commission about this? How should a thing like a centenary mark? Loads of conversations with the council and my now commission partner, Create. So Becontree, I'll start with a brief intro, because I'm guessing, has anyone ever been to Becontree? apart from Josh? Way. Oh, yes, at the back. So I'll give you a little history, not too much. So it was built via the 1919 Housing Act, known as the Addison Act. I think this is really important, a really important detail for Becontree, because Christopher Addison was the Minister for Health, and he triggered this Housing Act. And it was the first time in UK housing policy that this connection between dwelling and well-being were put into policy. But it's also quite cynical and paternalistic. It's always talked about in this narrative of like homes for heroes, like weren't the government great? They provided houses and they were really good quality homes. However, it was off the back of the war, and if there wasn't a huge drive for mass house building, there would have been proper civil unrest when people came home and found that there was no houses because they'd been bombed. So most of the first wave of residents that moved to Becontree came from slum clearance in the East End. So like Hackney, Poplar were moved out to pastures greener along the estuary. So the site of Becontree was identified by London County Council. They used to go out on these trips and find, empty spaces that they could build housing estates. And Becontree was definitely the biggest. So this is a plan of it under construction. And this bit here did get built, but isn't really considered Becontree. This is now Barking Riverside here. Which I think is important because Barking Riverside is one of the UK's largest housing developments at the moment, and you would think that they would learn from one of the largest housing developments of 100 years ago about failures and shortcomings, but absolutely not. That would involve crossing the road. So, yeah. When Becontree was built, the land was actually part of Essex. The most important thing about the 1919 Act was that it gave London County Council permission and powers to build outside of the boundary of London. And then what's happened over 100 years is the boundary of London has expanded. We have the Greater London Act, and now you have this huge kind of messy place, which is one place but also 100 other places. And that was my starting point, really, that how do you celebrate something as farcical as the centenary when A, loads of people don't know they even live in Becontree or care, and B, most importantly, people don't care, so what? Like, the world is kind of imploding, so how do you make something like a centenary relevant in an area which has got bigger challenges than setting off a confetti cannon to mark their house being 100 years old? And I found that farcical nature quite an interesting starting point, and also this idea of time and archaeology and flux, the fact that places are never complete. By the end of 1921, when the centenary year is 2021, only 14 houses out of 27,000 were complete. In 1935, the red ribbon was cut by the London County Council. So it was this idea of completion that has been driving my work. Like who says a place is complete with every kind of customization and hedge that's trimmed in a wonky way, or pebble dash that's applied, or front door that's painted a different colour? You're kind of one step away from this idea of London County Council completion, but really veering towards this great hot pot of just life and energy. And also, so this photo is always used. Those photos that I just showed, the black and white one, most people will always talk about Becontree in black and white, and looking backwards at the past. It was this 27,000 homes. Becontree's brilliant. And I've had many conversations with academics and architectural historians and boffins over the last 3-4 years, being like, I love Becontree. It's so great, isn't it? I'm like, have you ever been? And they're like, no. And I'm like, you should come, I'll take you for a walk. And they're like, nah. It's like a bit too far. Or I'd love to come. So I have led a lot of walks. And it's like, I'd love to come. I want to see the circus. So this is Valence Circus. And because it's like this icon that you see, it's always represented this iconic bit of planning. And there are amazing planning flourishes in the actual plan of Becontree. But when you actually get to ground level, it's just a series of the same kind of typology of rectangular blocks arranged in a circle. So I've had these amazing walks where you've got people traipsing along. Those that do make it, we'll call them the brave pioneers, and they come around the corner and they're expecting this kind of royal bath crescent sweep, and I'm like, here you are. It's here, and I really, really enjoy it every time. This is what it looks like at ground, and I think the dislocation between that and that couldn't be further. So that motivated me at the start of this commission to be like, yeah, let's actually tell the story of what Becontree's like, rather than the story that people tell about Becontree. So it's full of all of this generosity in planning, these like cut-throughs, this wide, but then they get closed. It's like this reaction, action. Someone makes a complaint about people loitering, playing a game or cycling, so then the cut-through gets closed, but the sign doesn't get taken down. This is a map of the LCC. I really like this map. Kind of shows how weird London was. So this top right-hand corner, there's a big empty void, which is, I live in this empty void now. Just outside this empty void. But the whole of kind of northeast London used to be Essex. And now this was where they were granted power to build. And that was the line that extended. And then you see Becontree over here is an absolute whopper compared to others that they built around the same time. I think the second biggest is here, and it's like 8,000. So really, it's bigger than the town that I grew up in. Almost 100,000 people, 27,000 houses. And that's it in context of the borough and in context of London now. So it's a third of the size of the borough. And I think this is that green, that the health connection and dwelling. Every house has a garden. These are all council houses too. So every single house has its own garden front and back. All of the flats, they're built like these kind of cottages on steroids but cut up into flats. They all have a little patch of garden behind them. So it's really, really generous in terms of the green provision. All the houses are brick, really good quality, and you have these huge parks. So compared to where I live in Hackney, where we're all living in Victorian houses cut up into flats or blocks where no one has a garden, as soon as the rain stops, we're outside just sitting on any bit of grass we can find, pretending it's the summer. There's a really different relationship to public space, which I think is super, super interesting for London. Because when it's a sunny day in Becontree Dagenham, these parks aren't filled with people having picnics or lying down or like playing music. They're people just walking their dogs. And I find that quite peculiar for London, but then not peculiar when we see how big their gardens are. Yeah, so the project is called Living Together, my big commission, as I said. First thing I did was deliver a flyer to all 27,000 houses saying, not by hand, I had loads of help, saying, I'm doing a commission, I'm not sure what I'm doing yet, but would you like to come and meet me? I've got some ideas. Would you like to join a residence group? Would you like to learn how to play the banjo? Would you like to be involved in making a book? Just some ideas. This is the gang that helped me. I love them. I'll talk about banjos while we're here. So I was thinking, this was in 2019, did a pilot year, thinking about how to test, because obviously it's so huge. People don't care that it's a centenary, so I wanted to test how I could develop activity that would get people involved across quite a large area. There's no, the problem with Becontree when it was planned is there wasn't enough social amenity or social infrastructure. There's not enough community centres, hardly any pubs by design, and those that were there closed down, nowhere to hang out, nowhere to kind of congregate or loiter. So it's very hard to actually meet people. And I like to work with the sort of non-joiner-inners, the people that don't go and join the groups, so the formal groups, the people that are a bit more reluctant or just stay inside. So this is this shape here. It looks like a banjo, like the musical instrument. And this is a planning anomaly that is specific to Becontree and Dagenham. And I love this. I think it's so weird. I've been in a different country, in Detroit, and I was talking about banjos, and someone was like, oh my God, are you talking about Becontree? I was like, yeah. So it's the only place in the world that they'll be referred to as banjos, and it's a pedestrianised precursor to the cul-de-sac. No cars. And so the LCC were obsessed with how do you foster communities within communities? How do we force relationships or miniature communities within this huge development? So you have 12 houses set around a little pedestrian area. And they are really nice. But then fast forward to now, all those 12 houses have got a car, maybe 2, and all of the cars are piled up on the street outside. So you have these little protected... What I really love, though, is when people move in, they'll quite often smash down the concrete bollard that marks the end and just reverse their car down anyway to try and move. That's a banjo from the front, and another one. And the reason I talk about that is because one of the pieces of work for Living Together was called Banjo on the Banjo. I wanted to see if I as an artist could celebrate something as perverse as a piece of housing policy with residents by doing an open call to see if anybody wanted to learn how to play the banjo. I don't know how to play the banjo. And yeah, all of these people and more actually came out and said, I responded to the flyer. So I held lots of drop-in sessions at a house. I mean, it is ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. I made a film about this as well, and I'll share it. Would you like to come to the house? So I met about 130 people over that drop-in session, which are actually really big numbers for Becontree, and had loads more phone conversations. And out of that, about 25 people said they wanted to learn the banjo, which I thought was insane. So then I had to do a national call-out for banjos to borrow them. So I drove to Wiltshire to a folk school to pick them up. All over the country, people were posting me them. And I commissioned a piece of music by Ed, who stood next to me. And all I said to him was, you have to be able to teach it to people who have never picked up a banjo before in 4 weeks. And I want you to write it sat on a banjo in Becontree. Like, I want you to do your composing, like, situated. So that's what he did, and we learnt. And basically we had, so the work was performed 100 years to 2 days after the centenary of the Addison Act, that piece of housing policy in 2019, as this first public moment of living together, where every banjo player was allocated their own physical banjo, and basically did a performance to sometimes nobody, but predominantly just the residents of the banjo. Some residents would come out and be like, what the fuck are you doing? Even though, like, I posted invitations to all of them, like get out of the way. Some residents came out and started dancing. Some enjoyed it. You see these kids behind. But it was mad. And then we processed, a bit like the Wicker Man, to the centre of that park, and all came together and performed. And there was about 250 people in that park on that day, which was... I hate using the word magical to describe work, but this did actually feel quite magical. The acoustics of the banjo, and in a very... Nothing like that had ever happened in the borough, and I stand by the weirdness. And as a piece of work, I think it was really important. So this group of banjo players, we kept meeting up until the pandemic, monthly, for banjo jams. None of us could play, so all we kept doing was playing the same song. But it was about this kind of collectively coming together. Then this group shifted and became a core part of the residents group that I still work with now. Yeah, so taxonomies of place, material palette, vernacular. How am I doing for time? Am I droning on? I'm good, okay. Tell me. So I started to sort of catalogue and record as part of this collection, everywhere where I could see individual choice. Everywhere where I could see, like, the resident coming out and, like, putting their own stamp on their home. So the UK got absolutely ransacked by the right to buy in 1980, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, who didn't like poor people or council housing, and gave council tenants the opportunity to buy their property at really, really, really rock-bottom prices. What happened as well, because she also didn't like industry or much. It's a really industrial borough, just much. There's the biggest Ford works in Europe is just around the corner. Huge industry, and it's a working class borough. So at precisely the same time as Right to Buy came about, deindustrialisation happened, and a load of people lost their jobs after just buying their home, which caused it's really visible in the housing. And I often think when I'm walking down the streets, if all these houses could talk the stories that they tell, what they've lived through, how they've ended up with this wavy hedge. And what you find now, and we're a really snobby country in the UK, sadly, and there's all sorts of tropes that go with working class culture and council housing especially, like, God, why would they do that to their house? Why would you? And I suppose I love it. I think more. But in terms of like, why wouldn't you? If you were given your home, and for years and years before, you were told exactly what colour you had to paint your front door, how, Becontree, you had to have your hedge cut a certain height. If all of a sudden you're told you can do anything, why wouldn't you? It's like getting dressed in the morning, and I think, long should that continue. So I started to record these changes, and some of them are pretty eccentric. You can see, harking this connection to London to Essex, quite a lot of the customisations you'll find in Essex sort of vernacular and like East Anglian drift, so a lot of mock Tudor, or mock Tudor. A lot of crazy paving, and it's trends, right? So the film I'm going to show you at the end, it's all to do with taste as well. Like, there's a line in the film that I'm going to play for the exhibition where I write that we're living in the time of the tasteful black tone and fake topiary ball. So this was the era of crazy paving, and you can see it drifts. I describe it as architectural drift, where I think residents, you get confidence from seeing things trialed out on other houses similar to yours. So a neighbour would see, oh, they've done that down the road, I might give it a go, but they do it in a different way. So all of a sudden you get these trends kind of like creeping around the place. And then the presence of individual kind of just pushing back, recording all these things. So this exists online as a website, as this kind of catalogue of place, really. And I like these sculptural moments of this furniture shop. Palm trees. Recording. So in 2 weeks' time, the Becontree group, with 15 members now, I've bought 15 palm trees with the last of my budget, and we're planting them across Becontree, one for each member of the group, but in public space instead of private space. You find these in private gardens, so they're going on amenity greens in the corner, and that's my last act in Barking and Dagenham. I'll romp through this because I'll just get to the exhibition, I think, because I'm going over time. And I'll share, and maybe Wouter, Michelle and Simone have already shared the link around. All of this catalogue exists online and is going to be archived physically. But I've been drawing, I'm a cartographer's granddaughter, so I always map as a way to think and draw together my relationships. And just thinking about, this got updated seasonally over 2021. With the solstices and the equinoxes, and published as a new chapter of how relationships, who else I've met, what else I've done. And I've been ripped off massively, so that's always good. Yeah, which is a true story. Pandemic hit, so I guess you can tell there's a lot of people involved. And when the pandemic hit, I just started to plan what was going to happen on this centenary year. All the partners were in place, and then all of a sudden the world closes. Generosity is kind of at the heart of my practice, thinking of like how can I make myself open, and also how do I open up the budget and distribute as much of the funding back in the place. But I wanted to maintain the relationships. Not everybody had a computer, digital access at all. So I started replicating the meetings as postal packs that were sent out monthly. We were having dinners every month which were themed, and I'd invite someone to talk. We'd select that person with the residents. So I thought, how could I replicate that in print form? So collecting and recording, I printed out little clipping notes from publications, and then sent digital cameras to get everybody to record their walks, and that then becomes part of the collection. And what I enjoyed about this, which was good for me actually, is the pace of it. It was, you send something by post with a stamped addressed envelope, people will get back to you whenever they can, especially in the pandemic. It was a really, really awful time, right? The first pandemic, number one, definitely in the UK. No one knew what was going on. And so we became pen friends as well, kind of like correspondence. You go from being this group of disparate people, like me, an artist, this group of residents, trying to work out what this centenary is, to opening up to each other via letter. And I think when we came back together afterwards on the other side, we were definitely much closer, and it was very weird. The website, don't you see that? So on the website, I was thinking, I kept having to adapt what I wanted to do, as everybody did. So this collection of objects and ephemera, thinking of different ways to share it. So I started making these films where I would activate one object from the collection or one item from the collection within a place. There's 12 of them. They were published once each month. Some aggregate floating in space. So this is the house in the background where we were doing the banjo playing. There is a groovy soundtrack, but I haven't got it in my PowerPoint. And then, so I'm just talking through some outputs, and then I'll be quiet. And then there was supposed to be an exhibition on site in Becontree, but that couldn't happen. So I thought, well, okay, instead of doing an exhibition in the physical place, I'll do the exhibition on billboards across Becontree and just really open up and think about the estate as the place. So I started to write these poetics, thinking about how to activate and if I had really good eyesight, I'd be able to read that, but I cannot. Millions of bricks beneath every pebble dash, crazy paved or mock Tudor wall. Just thinking about the sheer volume of materials. Just got obsessed about this materiality of place, this kind of archaeology of these layers and layers. I love this green line of paint, like what happened. I walked down the street and I met the owner of a home who was clearing a brick wall to build an extension, and he gave me this brick, and I asked him what the green paint was, and he's like, oh, it was when I painted my son's bedroom, and we spilt it on the brick wall. And I was like, do you want to keep it? Because it felt like a nice memory. He's like, no, I'm really happy to give it to you. You seem to like it. I was like, I really like it. So you get these interactions. This is on the station of Becontree Underground, and it felt really important to have this one here. So what does that one say? Acts upon acts of rights that have ebbed and shifted over the last 100 years. And that's the new Housing Act and how it affects private tenants. And that wasn't the most cheery bit of housing policy, this one. And that's how it was distributed from the council to residents. Tenants Handbook. Every resident, when they moved into Becontree from the 20s until, I think the last Tenants Handbook was issued in the 70s, would receive a copy of a Tenants Handbook full of rules, basically, and handy hints. So it would veer from telling you how to lay a fire out in your living room, how to pack it properly, because no one would have a fire, so quite useful, to telling you how to cut your hedge. So there was a sort of double-edged generosity versus paternalism there, because I think on the one hand, the council acknowledged it in archival letters where they were talking about their motivation for doing this. It was like, well, if we tell people how to make a fire, then they're not going to burn their houses down, and then we don't have to repair them. So there's this sort of like, please take it. And then this crazy, this pub, They're all over. They're beautiful. If I'd have been more prepared, I have postcards of all of these, and I would have brought them all for you. But what I'll do instead is post them to Michelle to share. So another output is I made a new version of the Tenants Handbook, which sounds like a small thing, but it was huge. And it was produced as an edition of 30,000 and went through every letterbox last year. Delayed because I don't know if it was the same here, but over the pandemic, everybody was really like losing their minds about post coming through the letterbox, thinking that it was going to be like have COVID on it. So people were like, yeah, honestly, people were like sanitizing their post and like ticking it up. It was absolutely crazy. So I thought it would be politically terrible for me to pump 30,000 envelopes through letterboxes at the time. So I held off until last winter. And this is and I will post you some of these actually, because it's a very beautiful document. And I fill it with artworks, these collages. But there's also, the one thing that's missing from the tenants' handbooks is the voice of the resident, because there was no resident there. The only voice, the dominant voice, is that of authority, the rule makers, the decision makers. So I assembled a virtual round table with a whole slice of residents and did a scripted series of questions, and the transcript of that weaves through the handbook, responding to key themes, housing politics, all of these things. Blah, blah, blah. Local material palette. I love these pictures of it being built. But then also looking to kind of like the builders merchants that you find just outside Dagenham, and how you see these treatments on the customizations, and they become their own kind of sculptural forms. This actually exists. I love this. I tried to commission this guy to make something for my exhibition, and he was not up for it. He only does interiors of shops, and I really wanted to commission him to be one of the makers for the Reba show, and I think he just thought I was insane. I'm coming to an end now, so that's good. But I'll go out with a bang. So this is the Royal Institute of British Architects, which is a very austere, posh place in London, and this is Becontree. And I was commissioned to have an exhibition in here. They do artist commissions every now and then. And I was commissioned to have one about Becontree as a kind of big part of living together. And I was like, oh yeah, I really love the idea of kind of positively disrupting Reba and filling it with the energy of Becontree. And I think positive disruption is a really great thing. Like how do you flip these power hierarchies and actually just open the door? Just get that door wide open and make it a space that people can walk into, which, if anyone's been to Reba, it definitely doesn't feel like that type of space. Day to day, I feel intimidated walking in there, and I've been commissioned. But I'm also not very posh, and I'm not an architect. So my first proposal was this idea of duality, that actually Reba becomes the off-site, and Becontree becomes the site. And I thought that was really important, just politically, and a really important way to start the thinking around it. That's me. My ego is not so out of control that I was delighted to see my name on the London Underground all over it. I hate the poster. I had nothing to do with the design of the poster, but they didn't tell me they were going up, and yeah, it was great. They were all over London, and I was just like, God, something tangible I could send my mum, you know, like, this is what I do. So, and also I didn't choose the title. I wasn't allowed to call the exhibition what I wanted it to be. If I'd have had my say, it would have been called On Completion. So have that in your mind. But I was told that was too people just will not get it, Verity. So instead it's called Lived in Architecture, Becontree Estate at 100, which is not quite as snappy and a bit more distressing. Anyway, when you have an exhibition at Reba, they have this amazing archive of millions and millions of drawings and photos of like any building you can think of, but hardly anything of Becontree, hardly anything. A couple of churches, and that's it. It was also in lockdown when I was mining the collection. So I do lots of like writing as part of my practice. So I wasn't able to actually see a lot of the things that I was searching in the collections. So I started to think about the actual descriptions of the items that I was looking at, and thinking I wasn't getting very far finding anything on Becontree. So then I thought, well, okay, let me look at the history of mock Tudor. Let me see how mock Tudor has found its way from the Tudor times to the side of a wall on Valence Avenue in Dagenham, or how crazy paving has found its way, how these drift through history and time and place. So we started to select items from the archives, and I started to think about how Becontree is a place that you move through. It's all of my work has been looking at the outside and imagining the inside, the interiors of the homes. I really respect that threshold. I've been into loads of homes. I know I have loads of friends that live there, but I really want to piece the narrative together from what I can see from outside, this political kind of hot pot from the customizations and these millions of individual choices. So then also, how can I represent people? So every single kind of fragment or component you see, I know the people that live in that house, and they're these kind of one-to-one, not one-to-one actually, because I also wanted to play with scale to annoy Reba. I wanted it just what would fit rather than, and just awkwardly shrunk it, which I also enjoyed. But it was very important that you get these brush strokes, because I know the owner of this house, Mr. Mann, he painted this himself. And he said that this always bothers him, but he's never gone out to repaint it. But he loves it. And his wife, they bought the house because his wife loved the pattern, and that's why they bought it. And I was like, I really love that. So this bit of work is, you would enter Reba, kind of where Michelle's sitting. You'd come through those big doors. And I really wanted there to be this sort of like, you know, like you keep coming, you're welcome. Something that you'd recognise and identify that gives you permission to cross the threshold. If you are coming from Becontree or Dagenham, you might see that and just think, oh, okay, yeah, that looks like the arch, this Becontree arch. It's kind of iconic in Becontree. I haven't talked about that too much, but it's one of these shared porches that LCC did as a way to force relationships. That was a huge battle to get that there. So you walk in. I'm not going to give you a walk around. I'll just talk about what the works are. Again, I wanted to flip it. Every time you go to a show at Reba, all of the collection works are on the white walls. They normally commission architects just to design stuff to hold the walls, stuff to kind of hold the things. Then there's a few kind of sort of installations or exhibits in the centre of the space. It's quite an awkward gallery space. And they obsess about it because it's a listed building and it's got this marble floor, and my God, like you can't do anything on the marble floor. So I wanted to flip. I wanted the walls to be empty, a place that you lean against and look into the work, and that the collections items would go on the inside. So the collection items become the behind the scenes, and the actual work goes on the outside. But this, where this photo's taken, I'm kind of leaning into the corner, and I really liked that. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. So you have these sort of mash-up components built, kind of like a stage set. There's one of the shared arches. So you get these awkward, forced. I always think, like, did this neighbour tell this neighbour they were doing this? Or did they just come out? For every house, I look on all of these things, like what was the decision-making process? Like, or did they just come out? And you have it on some houses where this half is even boxed in and the doors moved here. And I just really, really, really love thinking about that as a process. And I wrote a series of poetics based upon a narrative, kind of fictions, where I wove together some of the text from the archive material, the kind of descriptions of the archive material and the annotations on the archive material, alongside some of the conversations I'd had with residents. So this one says, a palace-like cottage. And that is the palace-like cottage. Attempts to keep the building unpretentious, finally thwarted by its size. And these are kind of hidden, just hidden in all the corners of the gallery. This gold lion is very important. You'll see it in the film. This family, I kept going to visit, and these gold lions, they really, really stand out on the street. They're super, super shiny. And I went and knocked on the door. First of all, I wrote everyone letters to be like, I love your house. I love your column. I love your lion. Can I come and talk to you? And they wouldn't reply to me, or they wouldn't call to me. So then I'd write again. It's me again. Or I go knock on the door. And then slowly, I developed these relationships. I went in for dinner to some of their homes. I was, it was a great process. But the gold lion, the first time I went round, they told me that the uncle had bought the gold lions off Facebook Marketplace. And then I went back and met the uncle. He was like, I'm the uncle. You hear that in the film. I was like, I love that. I love your lions. And he's like, I painted them myself. And I always really loved the fact that he'd gone to such care with the lion, but not painted the column. And I think that is so rich, actually, just as a value system. But then the last time I went round to actually do the sound recording, which was a day after I'd bought these copies of lions and painted them gold, I went round and their lions had been stolen. I was like, oh shit, like I haven't stolen them, like they're not mine. But what I'm doing now is that this lion is going to be installed back at their home, but properly, and resin mounted in so it won't be stolen. And you see this one, what is that? A dreary sameness that arouses an interest in the onlooker. I also wrote these double texts. These are thinking of the institutional voice and the artist voice, the kind of hard and the soft, this double agency, Becontree, Reba, these pairings, archive, fiction. So this says on complete, amend, adapt, add, change again, in completion, repeat. And each section had its own kind of alternative text, which again was a huge fight. Completion. And then wild fantasies are hardly worth considering. This is a piece of text from a Reba magazine from the 70s when they're talking about this architectural detail called pargeting, which you see everywhere in Becontree. It's like sculpted plaster. And in Becontree, it's like squirrels or acorns or like fruit baskets, but on the side of the house, or like horses and carts. They're amazing. And it was an article, a very snobby 1970s article with, this is disgusting, this is outrageous, why are people taking this tradition and putting it on their homes? And I just really enjoyed it. So I called my film Wild Fantasy Should Always Be Explored. And this is pargeting. So I commissioned a master pargeter or two to recreate and remake my favourite pargeted pieces. And for me, without going too much into the politics of the actual process, because that's a whole other lecture in itself, this room, this view, is where I think that's the exhibition for me and the film. And that's me. And then I'll show you the film.
We have time for one or two or three questions. I know Wouter for sure has a question, but yeah? Okay.
A question with regards to just one thing that I understood is that originally this was council housing, right? So they were all renters, or...
That's something I forgot. When I was watching it back, you
yeah.
forgot to say. It's important. They were all... When this estate was built,
Yeah.
everybody was paying the same, everyone had the same tenancy, and they were all paying rent.
And were they allowed to do all these... So it's because of the right to buy that you have this whole wave of home improvement.
Yeah, to do with right to buy, but also just how London's changed, right? Like London has, when Becontree was built, it wasn't considered London. Now you can't afford to live in London, so everyone's moving out. And Becontree's kind of the furthest you can go out. So land value's gone up. Because it was almost all council housing, there wasn't like a private rent economy there. But over the last 10, 15 years, there's a big influx of like private landlords buying up houses, renovating them, turning them into this term HMOs, houses of multiple occupancies. Do you know? It's a terrible culture where you take a family home and they're like bed sits for all intents. You cut it up, but it's kind of like 5 individual dwellings within one house where everyone has their own tenancy and you kind of have no rights at all, and it's all like landlordism, and they can charge what they want.
What I was getting at was that whether this cottage industry or this kind of creativity, the enormous amount of creativity put into these houses, there's a direct relationship with right to buy.
100%. I think, but I also think I'm just going to show you one slide. I think that the council also, on the council houses, they have also had loads of improvements over the 100 years. So council in the 1990s, the council had this quite natty scheme called Shape Up, where all council tenants could pick a colour out of a kind of a pastel colour palette to paint the outside of their home, and you could all change your front doors out of a choice of I think 3 colours. So that added this extra layer, and then loads of residents were like, I don't want to do those upgrades. But the right to buy has had a huge impact on Becontree, because it's gone from being 100% council housing to now 47% council housing in 42 years, which is quite quick, actually.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yes, thank you for your fascinating talk. I didn't know anything good came out of the right to buy scheme, but now I do know.
Some people have become millionaires out of the right to buy scheme.
Yeah, I know.
Which
I was wondering how the relations are between owners and tenants, and also surely the borough council must have an opinion on people redecorating their homes.
Yeah.
Beautification committees maybe also mingling in there.
I think the borough council's in a really tough decision because they don't have any money. It's one of the poorest boroughs in London, so they don't have enough funding. You know, when London County Council doesn't exist anymore. It became the Greater London Council, and then that was abolished. So all of the housing stock was transferred to Dagenham Council. So a very poor Outer London borough all of a sudden inherited 27,000 council homes with all the maintenance and upkeep that comes with that. So I think there's a tension which you see in these things. There's a real tension, and I think then the politics, there's so much more I could have talked about, like lots of different offshoots of this project, a lot of judgment and snobbery that comes with it, where the private homeowner will judge, you know, like, look at the state of their garden, it's really messy, it's overgrown, but with that then the world of work has changed. It's not because that person's lazy, it's because maybe they're doing 3 jobs, 4 jobs, and it's just not a priority to do the garden of their private landlord or do the garden of their council flat. So I think there's loads of tension actually. And then with the makeup of the boroughs changed, and especially Becontree, it was predominantly all white working class when it was incepted, but like London has shifted and changed, and it's actually diversified much for the better, but that's become quite a source of tension in terms of the council tenants or the historic kind of families that were there from the inception being pissed off because their children, grandchildren can't get a council property where they live, and it becomes a them and us, and not necessarily the private homeowner and the council tenant, the new like wave of immigrants and the former tenants. So it becomes this very contested space, which I think is super interesting and awful, because they're really good quality houses, and I think we know that's what I was talking about at the beginning with Barking Riverside. It's kind of really infuriating that you can, when there is consensus, you can build really good quality properly at scale with gardens for people that need homes rather than those that can afford them, and it's kind of all of that generosity gets undone, which I just find really distressing.
Any other questions? Yep.
Well, first, thank you for this very, very interesting approach to your work. I really find it fascinating. You started the first of this last part of the lecture saying that at the beginning, when you invited people to play banjo, there were no common spaces where people could go, there were no pubs and stuff this. After presenting your work, has this triggered any kind of public policy to create common spaces, to create a banjo house, to create a new spaces where people could go, or has this?
That would have been a really lovely outcome. But yeah, no. But what we are doing, because when I read out that list of words at the beginning, all of those buzzwords like legacy, people come. I've been designing my exit strategy from the borough. I've been saying for a long time that like I'm out. And I've really been trying to do it properly and ethically, because I've got all these relationships. I don't want to just finish and be like, fuck you, I'm off to like the next thing, no looking back. So I'm in a process of detangling, and part of that is with the Becontree group and this group. There's a whole other body of work where I've been working with a school group of teenagers as a young Becontree group. We've been writing a manifesto for like future Becontree, and we're going to perform and read that to decision makers, policy makers. And I've also, I was on the team that wrote the borough-wide local characterisation study for planning policy, so a lot of this has gone into that. Because I think that's, as an artist, like what can I leave behind that's actually useful, rather than like, oh look, I made this really nice film, and look, all these people can now play the banjo, and I've made these lovely billboards. It's also like, how can you actually, I talked about it as this operating between the cracks, how can I insert into that policy, at that policy level? And so a lot of the councillors have been involved in this project, and decision makers right from the beginning. But that's a good question and really important. But yeah, in terms of the community spaces, the borough's changed a lot since I first started working there. There's a lot, it's a priority borough for funding now, so all of a sudden, being very autonomous and no one wanting to work there, now everybody wants to work there. And I think that's quite cynical, because they're following the funding rather than genuinely, meaningfully wanting to make meaningful work. So I think it's going to be interesting in the next 10 years. But that's happening all the way around out of London, but particularly Far East. What I didn't talk about is part of my exit strategy is I've been doing some work in Detroit, thinking about similarities between Dagenham and Detroit and the post-Ford context. So before Brexit, I got a fellowship with the British Council and the Arts Council to go and do some research, thinking about the way that I work. So I did a mini residency with the planning department, a mini residency with libraries. I teach fine art and architecture, so I did some teaching there in those departments, thinking about, because the arts, and especially within socially engaged practice in America, has always been philanthropic. So how could I work with my ethical toolkit within this philanthropic context? Then the pandemic hit, then I had to stop, but I'm going back. So that's the out. Yeah.
Any last question? Or will we continue at the bar? Okay.
It was fascinating. I just wonder, are there any purists who want to keep their house as it ever was and even be critical to other people, like you should do this or...
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. So, about when did we do that field trip, Josh? 2 months ago. I hired a minibus and filled it with residents and urban designers, and there was a retired planner from the borough, and we went on a coach trip around outer London to go and visit those other London County Council estates. One of which is a conservation area, West London, lots of money. And it's very small. One of them is very similar to Becontree, 8,000 houses, bigger, same context, same challenges, let's say. But what we found is just this idea of touring places where, so the residents are like, whoa, this house looks identical to mine, but fuck, it's been maintained. Like, who's paying for that? Like, sash windows, original, but secondary glazing. And they were like, what's happened to us? Like, why? Over here. And it's about money, right? And politics, because there was never... The UK's attitude to conservation in the 70s was like, well, we're not interested in modern conservation. We're certainly not interested in conserving anything to do with, the working classes. That's come later. But as soon as anyone became... The planning department at Barking and Dagenham were really interested in trying to preserve a portion of Becontree as a conservation area, and I got pulled in do you know anywhere? Do you know anywhere? Imagining that you'd walk around the corner and find this amazing original street where everyone's still got their original door knockers. And I was like, well, no, no, because people have bought their houses and you haven't invested in it for ages. So no, it's too late. So and you can't undo that work. So I suppose I feel like this is a different type of modern conservation, and there should be some value placed in that, what's happened in the last 45 years. But it's just not as tasteful, is it? It's not as
About being tasteful, let's go to the bar.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Hope to see you during the Schools Out next month with BC Architects, and also at our school party. A warm welcome to... Verity-Jane, thanks a lot for your lecture. Yeah.